You can look at signs, street signs, for example, obviously museums, they're in parks. They are in the buildings that we see with names attached to them. So monuments are everywhere. The question is, do we see them and what do they mean to us? Wanted to talk about the fact that when we see monuments, in fact, we see monuments in our daily trips, whatever that may be. In fact, I took a trip recently and found myself at the Thurgood Marshall International Airport. Now, I've flown into Baltimore on numerous occasions, but on this particular occasion, it was announced that I was flying into the Thurgood Marshall Airport. So all kinds of visions occurred and the possibilities of change occurred just by that simple designation of that airport. And then when I arrived in Chicago, which was my final destination at that time, I found myself, I'm en route to my hotel on the Bessie Coleman Boulevard. Bessie Coleman was a pioneer aviator, African-American woman, and American Indian woman. But these symbols tell a story of diverse people whom one never saw. In fact, when I was in first grade, my teacher told me that Blacks had never contributed anything. And what impact does that have on students, on individuals in general? And here you see in prominent places monuments to groups that you belong to or you have some affinity with.
This is really key in terms of how we define this notion of monument. And I'll speak to it in two different ways. So one is the typical notion, at least from the late 19th to the early 20th century, of the idea of a monument commemorating some historical moment for the general public. Usually that's decided officially through arms of government or large institutions that represent collectives for a general public and representing a general public's point of view. But I've also seen monuments and memorials emerge as a result of something that has happened at that place. One of the examples that I can think of is the particular site where Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, and it has been transformed into a space that people can go visit to understand and contextualize some of the physical stakes of protest and protest culture in the US and what was actually sacrificed by people to make that location. I've also studied and noted the ways that the first White House of the Confederacy, which was initially just a gentleman farmer's house in the kind of Southern plantation tradition, then becoming the president of the Confederacy's first house, and then later being removed from its site and put on a truck and moved physically to the Capitol in Montgomery, Alabama, as a way of commemorating what was represented by the Confederacy. I don't think the initial design at all conceived of this house becoming a memorial or a monument in the ways that we understand it, but it has been elevated to that status as a way of physically manifesting and preserving the cultures of the US South. And so I think it's really interesting when that kind of process occurs, when we have physical events or social events that occur that we deem important, and then we associate it with that particular site. So in some ways, we could be living in a monument and we have no idea, or we could be passing by something that will become a monument and we have no idea. And so in those ways, it's exciting because our general publics might be constructing meanings in a way that will be memorialized in the future, which gives a sense of gravitas to the everyday happenings that we are engaged in.
I think there's monuments that are in public spaces that are easily visible. I think that there's thousands of monuments that are unmarked throughout the world that are invisible, but someone somewhere wanted to remind people of a place, a person, an event that shaped them.
I think that the meaning that is associated with the monuments in public spaces probably requires greater debate than those in private spaces. And so I could think of, for example, a few of the um, philanthropic societies that I visited while teaching and living in Charlotte, North Carolina, which is a very large banking center. And on the ground floor of some of these buildings, you'd have the kind of very public art, the WPA style frescoes in the lobby, which was meant to demonstrate what the relationship of the bank was to the public, to the collective. But then if you were privileged enough to go to the upper floors, you could see different forms of monumentalization in these private spaces, from the busts of people who were important to the bank's history to different forms of public artworks that were created for those kinds of spaces. Um, Now, in a sense, those are still public in terms of the types of executives and upper administrative persons and positions within that bank. But to the general public, this is a space that doesn't really exist. And the creation and the commemoration of memory in those spaces, I think, circulates among a restrictive kind of public that only becomes interesting when that public is increased and when we get to see more of it.
So when we're speaking of a monument, we're not only speaking of a physical object, we're not only speaking of a physical context or spatial context in which that monument is located or visible or part of a space, be it social, cultural, familial, and so forth. I can think of monuments also being used very deliberately to signify conquest, to signify power, to suggest something more than itself. And I can think of historical examples in which monuments had one mission in their establishment and at the same time can be read, understood, and complicated by that presence. So what's always intriguing to me is that monuments have such manifold ideas, questions, relationships that go beyond the physical, and they go beyond even the linguistic, if we could think of monuments as inscribing a text in space, speaking to a history, a person, a narrative, and so forth. So what we could say is that a monument is both welcome and unwelcome by the very people that have established it.
Yeah, this is interesting because I think most people will start to talk about this in terms of public spaces, like space, physical space. Whether we've transitioned from the 19th century Baroque model of city planning, where we have plazas and spaces that are formalized for these kinds of things, to the 20th century post-war model of corporatized spaces where public art exists. We see them now either in the lobbies of buildings, in the plazas in front of them. In Buffalo, we have a series of them in our metro stations. Like there are places where public art is supposed to be. But I actually think that we'd have to take a step back to really understand this, because the physical space and the presence and our relationship to it is really the result of the ways that monuments exist in our mind and the ways that we understand our relationship to these objects. And sometimes these things exist and we just really treat them as landmarks in the landscape. We don't understand what their meaning is. And it isn't until a public conversation around them occurs that we start to then think about them in slightly different ways. And so I think that this mental or cognitive reception of monuments is leading to a liberalization of where we expect to see them. We can see them in private homes. We can see them in commercial centers, industrial centers. But public art and where the public exists is both less formalized than it was previously. Like not every town has a city hall. Not every town has the kind of space where everybody comes together. It's a forum for ideas. And so we're looking for places to put these things.
I love this term, a fugitive monument. That's such a poetic sense, because fugitivity signifies a transit of movement through or of space. I hearken back to a little writing I did on the Aksum obelisk that was taken from northern Ethiopia during the Italian conquest in the 1930s. And the Aksum obelisk was 4th century stele from Aksum in Ethiopia, and then brought in 3 pieces. It was found in 3 pieces. It was brought in 3 pieces then through what was the colony of Italian colony of Eritrea, brought to the port of Massawa, put on a boat, and then brought to Italy and to Rome in particular. So, and it was there to mark the 15th anniversary of the rise of the fascist party and conquest. And in 1947, the Italian government signed an agreement basically to return this obelisk. And it wasn't until many decades later that it actually was accomplished. By virtue of its return, which has its own set of stories and own sets of its own fugitivities in terms of meaning and money and political and social agreements that were happening with the Ethiopian government of the time. So I would love to think that monuments in general are always fugitive, just like ideologies and individuals are also fugitive. And in their marking, in their establishment, in their fabrication into space, is an attempt to fix that fugitivity, when in fact it does the opposite. It actually engenders it engenders a certain set of transitory meanings that are always going to be in play.
I love to think about monuments and fugitivity, in part because there's a story here that I'll share with you that's really close to my heart. When I first moved to New Mexico, I heard about a kind of fugitive act. Either a single person or a group of people cut off the foot of a bronze conquistador monument dedicated to Don Juan de Oñate. Oñate was the first governor of New Spain, which became New Mexico. He had an incredibly violent history, most notably during what is called in historical texts the Acoma War. The Acoma War was when he ordered his troops, including his nephew, to raid all the food stores of the Acoma people. Of course, the Acoma men fought back and they killed people, including Oñate's nephew. And the kind of form of New World, quote unquote, justice was swift and without remorse. Oñate ordered the right foot cut off of any Acoma surviving man over the age of 25. And keep in mind that his men murdered 800 villagers, including women and children. They sent a lot of the children to Mexico to slave in missions, Spanish missions. And the women were also forced into indentured servitude. So this cutting of the feet included men from Acoma, young men and older men, but also from any surrounding pueblo, because what Oñate, of course, was trying to do was trying to, forcibly submit, any person. he saw to be under his rule. So when the foot was cut off that conquistador monument and taken, it enabled people to start talking about this again. It brought it to the forefront. So this act, which was inevitably a fugitive act, the foot was stolen. They mailed what you could consider almost like ransom letters to both the Albuquerque Journal and the Santa Fe New Mexican, saying what they were going to do with the foot. One of their ideas for the foot was to melt it down into bronze medallions for the historically ignorant.
Again, like a lot of the conversations around toppling monuments, when people pull them down, when people like put graffiti on them and there's like actions taking place, the media portrays these actions as violence. Riots are violence, glass, storefronts are being broken, this is violence, this is violence. In my opinion, this is not violence at all. This is a reaction to violence. And you're talking about objects. You're not talking about people. So to be held hostage or fugitive, it's almost like maybe we should reserve those terms for, human lives and, be a little bit cautious to use these terms for objects.
As a form, monuments have a tendency to articulate a very fragmented, very limited either interpretation or perspective on history. And that partiality has a way of becoming much larger, it rules out and it obliterates other potentials for meaning. And this, for me, is a perfect instance of a monument that is held hostage. And so how does one then insist on not resituating meaning within a monument within another absolute truth, but simply saying, to what extent can a monument be freed up? I always think of the Columbus Circle in New York City. Whenever I would walk by this thing, I would always think so that this thing has a multiplicity of meanings depending on who's approaching the circle. So that kind of thing, but to insist that it's, on the one hand, a celebration of this heroic mythic figure without all of the other ugliness, then I think is to hold the monument hostage.